Well, hello and welcome back to the Screwtape Letters. This is lesson 7 as we consider letters 16 through 18 of the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And the chapters don't have titles. They're given numbers, Roman numerals in the publication. The Screwtape Letters, the collection of fictional imaginary correspondence between Screwtape, a senior demon, and his nephew Wormwood. And so by now you're well acquainted with the format and what Lewis is teaching and how he is teaching it as he thinks backwards, so to speak. As Screwtape, when he will refer to the enemy, he's referring to his enemy, referring to God. So we're here at lesson 7, and we begin today's look at letter 16, which we could title The Church. The Church, letter 16. And it's here that Screwtape gives Wormwood some advice and instruction on how to have his patient even consider the church. And he tells Wormwood that if he can't keep his patient out of church altogether, which is the ultimate preference for Screwtape, then he needs to turn the patient into what you and I might call a church hopper, someone who's never satisfied. Here, let me quote Screwtape. "Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that, quote, suits him until he becomes a taster or connoisseur of churches." I've often heard that approach as the cafeteria approach of churches. I like this. I like the music here. I like the children's program here. I like the youth program here. I like the preaching here. And so a person just becomes a connoisseur. They become an expert of churches. It's like what's said of the man who said, I'm an expert at quitting smoking. I've done it hundreds of times. Somewhat that mentality when it comes to churches. And, of course, Screwtape Letters written in 1940. It couldn't be more relevant here in 2020. He's speaking, Screwtape that is speaking about a mindset that's crept into our culture. And it's this consumerist mentality when it comes to the church. People choose churches. Does it like they choose a restaurant? Or maybe a gym? Does it meet my needs? Here are my criteria, and does it check off every single box? That's not to say there aren't boxes for the church that need to be checked. The reformers carefully delineated the 3 marks of the true church: the faithful preaching of the gospel, the faithful administration of the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and the right and faithful administration of church discipline. I mean, those are 3 big categories, 3 big boxes that need to be checked. But we all must be careful about a consumerist mentality, where we come to the church strictly with the mentality of, what can this church do for me? And if it's not scratching every itch, then I want to leave it. Screwtape writes this: "The search for a, quote, suitable church makes the man a critic where the enemy," of course to him that's God, "where the enemy wants him to be a pupil." God would have us not be critics, but pupils. So Screwtape goes on to write, "So pray bestir yourself and send this fool the round of the neighboring churches as soon as possible. Your record up to date has not given us much satisfaction." I like that. And so then Lewis begins to mention the 2 churches that are in his parish. And here we go back to where Lewis is writing. He's in England, the Church of England, which had, and perhaps still has, I'm sure to a much lesser degree, more of a parish mentality, more of a neighborhood church mentality. And being the Church of England, it was the predominant church to choose from. And he says here, there are two different choices you have here. One is what he might call a low church type of Anglican church, the other being a high church. And the first is, he describes this way, the first is led by a pastor, again, Screwtape talking, who has been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-headed congregation that it is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief and not vice versa. So here's a church where there's a denial of the gospel, a denial of the truths of Christianity. And then Screwtape, Lewis through Screwtape, writes about the other church. This church happens to be led by a man, a vicar, a pastor, whose name is Father Spike. And he writes, the man cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. But as we think through that, and a little bit of that discussion, a little bit of that letter is colored by Lewis's own context. Speaking of one church of high liturgy, one of low, I'd like to believe, and I do believe, that at least within our denomination, you wouldn't have this, if you were thinking PCA churches, you wouldn't find such a broad spectrum. Lord willing, the PCA church would be committed to the gospel and to the Bible as authoritative. But having said that, Screwtape then writes about what he likes about both of these churches. He says they're both, quote, party churches. Now, he didn't mean they're wild churches having wild parties. He mean they are churches that are centered around something other than the gospel. They have that a more of a, perhaps you might say sectarian. Maybe that's too strong a term, but they're centered around what Lewis calls the unessentials. I might call the non-essentials. Where we see something similar in our day. Perhaps maybe it's a church that holds up as one of the highest virtues. Their rallying point is they're committed to one translation of the Bible. That's not a primary, secondary, not even, perhaps not even a tertiary commitment. Some churches could get absorbed around how they educate their kids. Those, not that educating your children is unimportant, but to a divisive level, how you educate might be an issue, might be a point of division. So churches should find their unity. They shouldn't be these just an enclave of people who look alike, sound alike, and think alike on all matters. But they're people who find unity in the gospel and the person and work of Christ, and his divinity, his humanity, in the virgin birth, in his sinless life, in his atoning death, in his resurrection from the dead, in the authority of Scripture. These are the things around which a church should unite. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone. That's if there's ever to be a party spirit, that's where we would find our unity. One last quote from that letter. We have quite removed from men's minds what that pestilent fellow Paul used to teach about food and other unessentials, namely, that the human without scruples should always give in to the human with scruples. I thought that was an interesting way to put it. So that's Lewis as he talks about the church. If you can't keep him out of church, then get him into one of these weak and rather divisive churches, and have him cultivate this consumerist mindset. Well, let's consider letter 17, and I would put the title for this particular letter as Gluttony. I found this to be some very, very thought-provoking content in letter 17. It causes you to think about gluttony, that term, in a way I believe most of us have never thought of it before. Lewis, through the mouth of Screwtape, just dissects this idea. He says gluttony is a whole lot more involved than just wanting to eat too much. I want to read you a few sentences. The context for this part of the book, this particular letter, is Screwtape is referencing another devil whose name is Glubos. And Glubos' patient happens to be the mother of Wormwood's patient, right? As we've seen in previous letters, Wormwood's patient still lives with his mother. And so Screwtape is holding up as an example for Wormwood the work of Glubos and what he's done with the mother. Let me read you a paragraph. Glubos has this old woman well in hand, writes Screwtape. She is a positive terror to hostesses and servants. She's always turning from what has been offered her to say with a demure little sigh and a smile, "Oh, please, please. All I want is a cup of tea. Weak, but not too weak. And the teeniest, weeniest bit of really crisp toast." You see, because what she wants is smaller and less costly than what has been set before her, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. At the very moment of indulging her appetite, she believes she's practicing temperance. Now, as you catch his definition, he says, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants. So it's Lewis, through the writing of Screwtape, is defining gluttony more as self-absorption, self-centeredness. And I think Lewis is really putting his finger on the human heart. He's showing us how far our self-centeredness can really go. Screwtape goes on to describe in this letter how the mother's insatiable demand for the exact and almost impossible palatal pleasures, and palatal, I guess, from the palate. Let me start again. Her insatiable demand for the exact and almost impossible palatal pleasures are her controlling desires. And what do they produce in her? Ingratitude, a sense of entitlement. It's the destructive power of self-centeredness and sin. It destroys relationships. It destroys us. And Screwtape finishes this letter near the end by saying, mere excess in food is much less valuable than delicacy. I thought that was a very thought-provoking letter as he considers the topic of gluttony in this way. Well, let's consider, lastly, letter 18. And we might entitle this letter, Love. Love. Screwtape writes to Wormwood these words: the enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. So here, Lewis, through the mouth and writing of Screwtape, is starting to get into sexual temptation, the relationship of the place of sex within marriage, and really what a basis for long-lasting marriage is. At the time Lewis wrote Screwtape letters, he himself was not married. You may know Lewis's story that he married later in life. It was in the 50s before he married a woman by the name of Joy Davidson. They were married for just a short while, I want to say 2 or 3 years before she died of cancer. Anyway, and he, but so my point is, Lewis is writing about marriage. He's yet to experience it himself, but nonetheless, he has some, I believe, some great biblical insight for us. Now, of course, in writing a letter from a devil, a demon, he has Screwtape mock, as you would expect, a biblical sexual ethic. And what he envisions, what he encourages, is the promotion of a strategy that links marriage in what he calls a short-lived experience of what the humans, call being in love. mean, basically he's saying we want the humans to think that the only basis for ever getting married is the over-romanticized view of love. If you remember, Lewis gave a series of radio addresses called The Four Loves, which got turned into a book. Eros is one of those loves, and that's what he's talking about here, from which we get the word erotic, the over-romanticized view of love. The other three terms would be philos, brotherly love, and agape, and storge are the words that Lewis gets into, and I won't take us off on that rabbit trail. But Screwtape, as Lewis writes his letter, says that if we can fuel this type of basis for marriage, strictly the view of love, the word for love, and this is me drawing from the Four Loves that Lewis would write, that this eros foundation, then what we can have the humans believe is that if the feelings of love, if the romanticized view of love, if those feelings go away and wear off, and they're gone, then the marriage is gone. And so the dissolution of the marriage is therefore justified. And that's why Lewis is saying through Screwtape, we've got to foster this, that should be the basis for human relationships, particularly marriage, because that has the greatest opportunity for the marriage to be destroyed. But then Screwtape speaks rather eloquently about the notion of love is really rooted in the nature of God himself. This is really good. This is Screwtape writing. Thus he, speaking of God, to him is the enemy, thus he is not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. Isn't that good? He's not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one. He's triune. In order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. That the nature of love is rooted in the nature of God himself. God has always existed in relationship. He's never been lonely. There's been one God who's always existed in three equal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's the basis for a biblical understanding of love. And it helps us understand ourselves, that we're made for relationship. We're made to have friendships. We're made to have connection with family. For some, God's given the gift of marriage as a means. And certainly doesn't mean if one is unmarried that they've somehow missed out on life, no more than the Apostle Paul or even the Lord Jesus missed out on life. But nonetheless, we're made for relationship, and that reflect our being made in God's image. Our capacity for relationship is rooted in the very nature of God himself, whose image we bear. And so really the bottom line of this letter is that Screwtape speaks about how, in his own backwards way, makes the point that that the fundamental reality of marriage, the bedrock of a marriage, should be rooted in a covenant more than feelings. The covenant actually precedes the feelings. Let me read a quote, and I think this will be clear. And if you've read the letter, you've read this quote already. The humans, Screwtape writes, are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted view of something the enemy really promises as its result. He says, humans who have not the gift of continence or self-control can be deterred from seeking marriage as a solution because they do not find themselves, quote, in love. And thanks to us, the idea of marrying with another motive seems to them low and cynical. Yes, they think that. So it's really interesting. So you read this letter and you almost think that Lewis is in favor of arranged marriages, and that's not the case. But he's arguing for, I believe, a covenantal understanding of what marriage is. I know that as I've met with couples, and done premarital counseling, one of the things I tell them, I said, there's a sense that in your wedding ceremony, you could strip away every bit of romantic fluff and imagery from the ceremony. It's an add-on. It's not essential to the ceremony. And by that I mean, what happens in a marriage ceremony is there's a covenant made between a man and a woman. And a covenant is promises or vows. I know Tim Keller said long ago that he stopped doing weddings and allowing couples to write their own vows. And I liked the fact that he said it, and I like why he said it, so I've adopted the same policy. He said because it was his experience that when couples wrote their own vows, the vows basically were something to the effect, here's how you make me feel, and here's how I feel about you. Now, how does that differ from what we might call, quote, traditional marriage vows? Well, a traditional marriage vow is I promise to be faithful to you. I promise to love, care, and protect you till in sickness and in health, till death do us part. There's a sense in which love is sacrifice, love is commitment, love is loyalty, is what's expressed in a marriage covenant. And Lewis would argue that out of that commitment, romantic love, the fun side of love, if you will, grows and flows. I think probably the way our culture works, Lord willing, it's a mixture. I think typical relationships starts off with high degree of romantic feeling, but Lord willing, over time, a true relationship is built. Well, one of the benefits I've seen of couples meeting via the internet is that they learn about each other in a way that if they just strictly met and it was all based on physical attraction, could lead to whitewashing the relationship and purposely overlooking potential problems. So this is what we see in this letter on love is that Lewis is raising the bar of marriage. That marriage ought to be based on something more than, not less than, but more than strictly romantic love. That biblical love is not mere emotion, it's sacrifice, it's commitment, it's loyalty, it's dying to self. So this is Screwtape letters 16, 17, and 18. Next week we'll be at 19, 20, and 21. But appreciate you being with me. I'm enjoying doing this. As is usual, when one teaches, that person's usually the greatest beneficiary, and I've really enjoyed digging deep again into the Screwtape letters. See you next time.